In Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti, Laura initially loses her innocence when she eats the fruit from the Goblin Men. The goblins seem to be like these tricky magical creatures who sell like the super tempting fruit, and Laura offered a piece of herself as payment for the fruit. She, against regards for anything, her sister tried to warn her that don't eat it, don't talk to him, but she does give in to the temptation and she does do it anyway. The fruit does make Laura very sick and obsessed. I mean, it's just like her whole everything changed. She went from this happy, healthy person to like this sick and ill maniac. Um, so I would say that Laura does lose her innocence by making like this really bad choice, not listening to any kind of warnings. And it's just one of those situations that she didn't fully understand. Though she messes it up, her sister does kind of like this like self-sacrifice kind of thing to restore Laura back to how she was before. And Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates. Connie loses her innocence when she steps outside of her house initially. But previous to that, I would say Connie herself, she's just naive. She doesn't understand how the world works. She likes flirting with boys, but she doesn't understand the real life danger that there is. When Arnold comes over, he acts weird. He pretends to know everything about her, everything in her life. It just gets more and more demanding. He gets forceful. He tells her to come outside. She's scared. She doesn't understand what's going on. She just loses her innocence as soon as she steps out of the threshold of her safe zone, which would be her house. Temptation through religious allegory and Goblin Market. It it shows the temptation through the goblin men and their fruit, which kind of represents like the forbidden sin, that Adam and Eve dealt with in Genesis of the Bible. Um, Laura can be definitely compared to Eve. She's curious, tempted, and unable to resist this forbidden goblin fruit. Okay? She was warned not to eat it. She did it anyway. She suffers the consequences. And that can be related to the fall of humankind after sin. And one could say maybe Lizzie, her sister, is more like Jesus. She seems pure. She saves Laura through love and sacrifice, and it showed that initially redemption is possible. Temptation through religious allegory in Where Have You Going, Where Have You Been? It's through Arnold Friend. You know, he is kind of characterized as the devil, by the way he looks, the way he walks, his powers to be able to draw an X in the air, his knowledge about Connie. He initially tricks Connie with like all these words and all this through temptation to get her away from her home, her house, which is her safe zone. He just draws her in, but then she gets like this gut-wrenching feeling that something is wrong. In the end she gives in. She just She gives in. And yes, this leads to the loss of innocence. It shows exactly how Satan tempted Eve in the Bible, in the fall of Eve, more or less, within the Garden of Eden in Genesis. The exploitation of women through symbolism and Goblin Market is that the goblins and their fruit symbolize the exploitation of women. The fruit looks tempting, but once Laura eats it, she becomes weak and desperate, showing how women can be deceived and used. The goblins' trade with Laura reflects on how women can be taken advantage of, as Laura gave a piece of herself as payment for the fruit. And Lizzie's resistance and sacrifice as she was being attacked by the goblins is a way that women fought back against the exploitations of themselves. The exploitation of women through symbolism. The exploitation of women through symbolism and where are you going, where have you been? Arnold Friend himself symbolizes the exploitation of women because he's very manipulative. You know, his whole existence in the storyline of where are you going, where have you been is just cruel. He uses his charm, his lies, and everything to just lure Connie away from her home. And it is just a prime example of women being taken advantage of by a man who somewhat promises them something that they do truly have a desire for. In Connie's case, it's attention. It's just, I mean, she's your typical teenage girl. She's boy crazy. I mean, ultimately, in the end, though, she is forced to give up her innocence to face these consequences of being exploited. And my visual for Loss of Innocence, I have this kind of like little artwork. It is kind of like a painting, a collage, like everything kind of all in one, just kind of thrown together. So, like, we have the dark that represents like hell, and then we have a little angel in the corner, kind of floating, represents heaven. And then in between, we have like all these girls, women, all different ages, all different ethnics, just all that jazz. And it represents, losing your innocence is one of the hardest things a person can go through. And I mean, it can happen at any age. It doesn't matter if you're old, you're young. It doesn't matter. What matters is that moment that somebody realizes that the world isn't as wonderful or safe as they might have thought it was, that hurts. And it could be, you getting hurt by someone you trust. You're facing a super hard truth about something important, life or whatnot. Or it could even be like making a big mistake. It just, it's hard because all of these feelings that the person would have, it leaves them exposed. Um, it's like that sense of peace within your soul, it just disappears. And the only thing that you are left with is that reality. That's just scary. because you don't know what to think. And even though it hurts, you always have that moment that you're going to grow stronger because you're going to reach towards that light. You're going to look at that darkness and you were just going to leave it in the past. But in Goblin Market and Where Are You Going and Where Have You Been, it's two different scenarios. Connie experienced that loss to temptation whenever she walked outside of that house. And she never came back. Though it was left to the reader's discretion to figure out what happened because it didn't say, I think most people can acknowledge that she got raped and murdered. Because Joyce Carol Oates did base it upon a real life serial killer, Charles Smeen. So she didn't get that, oh, this is going to make me stronger kind of thing. You know, she was left in the dark. In Goblin Market, Laura got that redemption. Lizzie sacrificed herself so Laura would thrive. Laura gave in to the temptation with warnings from Lizzie that it wasn't a good idea. But Laura still paid the price with a piece of herself. She also, in a way, moved on from it. You know, she's able to talk about it. But some people just aren't that lucky. And you have that option to let the darkness consume you, or you can see a little bit of light in the future.